Um, my name is Rick Judd. I've been a vegetable gardener for about 30 years, and I've been a University of Delaware Master Gardener since 2011. Today we're going to talk about compost, subtitled Trash to Treasure, and much more. Topics we'll be going over is the value of compost, the ingredients of compost, structure of the composter, troubleshooting, compost tools, look who's coming to dinner. That's just, we're talking about the inhabitants of the compost pile, and finally, using compost. The one thing I want you to take out of this meeting, if nothing else, is that compost happens. It's easy. There's no sorcery needed to get magic results. So I got my Disney Sorcerer's Apprentice, and he's looking right at the compost happens sign. And that's what I want you to remember, okay? This is in front of some potatoes that I have going this year. So the value of compost, we're going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. We're going to talk about the value to the environment and the value to the soil. And I guess there would be maybe a dotted line to value to the soul as well. The University of Southern Indiana talks about each American generating about 1,200 pounds of compostable organic matter each year, and having to dispose of it at the cost of $50 per ton to go to the landfill and $65 to $70 a ton to go to incineration. And of course, you have the added issue of if it's going to the landfill, it's taking up space. As it's incinerating, it's taking up good air, basically. Finally, or as a second item, there's a very interesting concept of zero waste management. I think that's a fascinating concept. It's like if you take a big cardboard box and put it over your house and your yard, things are allowed to come in, but nothing's allowed to go out. In other words, you're dealing with it on site. And that is, composting is certainly a very essential part of that as we move toward that goal. Every 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot composter is 64 cubic feet that don't go to the landfill and don't require transportation to it. And then finally, the universal paradox, right? The pleasure of turning something valueless into something valuable. I mean, history is just loaded with examples. The stone rejected becomes the cornerstone. The phoenix rises out of the ashes, and the age-old quest of the alchemists for turning lead into gold. Well, this is an opportunity for you to turn your refuse, your valueless material, your garbage, your rubbish, into compost, which is called by backyard gardeners, many of them, garden gold for its tremendous value and properties to the garden. What does a compost pile look like? Well, my compost pile anyways, for my waste stream, everybody will have a different waste stream. But as I throw materials that we've generated through the winter into the compost pile, we get a preponderance of paper towels, cardboard egg container, tea bags, coffee grounds with the filters, stems and leaves of flowers, etc. And I think there might be an onion skin up here. That's kind of the way the compost pile looks like in early March. As the year goes on, we get grass clippings to add to it, and the fire in the compost pile really starts, the heat, and we start the process of composting. So what is so special about this material that provides so much value to the soil? I like to think of it in terms of really increasing our ability to manage water in the garden. The organic matter in compost makes the soil act like a sponge. It increases water absorption. It retains more water, and it is great for water distribution in the soil. In other words, if you have some area of your soil that might be a little wetter than others, it tends to pull that moisture into the drier areas. Also, because compost is made of agglomerates, there's plenty of airspace between these particles. It improves the air distribution into your soil. So it allows the roots of plants to breathe as well as drink. It also provides a low-level, slow release fertilizer. And one thing about this area, at least for this climate and the temperatures that we experience, about 1 to 2 inches of compost get used up each year. So it's wise to at least produce enough to put 1 to 2 inches on your garden at some point of the year. And then a little plug, make sure to visit our vegetable teaching garden site, our demonstration site on 461 Wyoming, because we have several types of composters and folks who would be more than willing to talk with you about composting. I have here as I mentioned, compost, the organic matter tends through the porosity and it introduces into the soil, tends to give the soil a function of similar to a sponge. Both operate on capillarity, the capillary response to pull water into areas of the soil or the sponge. So this is my visual aid to remember what the sponge effect in your soil is like once you add compost. Talking now about the ingredients in a compost pile. This one slide really has it all. This is the kind of the Cliff's Notes version of composting as far as I'm concerned. The ingredients in an aerobic compost pile, and I stress aerobic because it's air-based and it is the fastest way of composting. The ingredients include carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. The tip is to cut up your carbon and nitrogen ingredients as small as possible, and I'd suggest a lawnmower is oftentimes very helpful in this because that increases the surface area of the interaction in the pile. Mix all these ingredients together into a pile, turn them once a week for fast composting. This allows more air to be beaten into the pile. And then finally, keep the pile as wet as a wrung out sponge. And it's really as simple as that. What ingredients contain carbon and nitrogen? Ingredients that are heavy in carbon would be leaves, paper products, paper towels, napkins, etc., cardboard, and straw. Ingredients that are heavy in nitrogen would include grass clippings, weeds, vegetable and fruit peelings, coffee grounds, tea bags, etc. Eggshells can be a great addition to the pile as they give calcium to the pile. But note also that grass clippings are very valuable in this effect. And I stress weed killer free grass clippings. In other words, non-herbicided grass clippings. As you lime your lawn, you introduce a lot of calcium and magnesium into the lawn, which is captured in the grass and is added to the pile. Avoid meat, fish, fats, and dairy products, as these might attract critters to the pile that you do not want. And then finally, avoid glossy magazine print, as the pigment used in those materials often contain heavy metals. We talk about carbon and nitrogen in the pile. Finished compost is about 25 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. You have some differing views on this. It may go up as high as 30 to 1. But basically, every ingredient you add to the pile is going to have a different carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you want it in the end to end up with your finished product at 25 to 1. So obviously there have to be carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich ingredients in the pile. If you have too much carbon, then the decomposition will take place slowly. If you have too much nitrogen, then because those ingredients often add water as well, you may slime the pile or compress the pile in a way that you go anaerobic, which results in sulfurous smells. So let's look at the different ingredients that you may have in your home and your yard that could be included in the pile, and the different carbon and nitrogen ratios of those ingredients. Once again, I put a red line across where generally the finished compost will be at about 25 to 1. So the ingredients that are, as you go up above the red line, you have lower and lower amounts of carbon in that ratio. So that means higher amounts of nitrogen, basically. As you go below the line, you have higher amounts of carbon and in that ratio. So these are all different things that you try to combine things from above the line with things below the line in your composter, so that ultimately it roughly balances out. This slide I have in here simply, once I get into the grass growing time of the year, grass becomes a very important ingredient in the pile. It adds nitrogen, it adds water, and it really, as far as I'm concerned, is lighting the candle. It's what really gets the composter going. We'll talk about structures of composters now, and this is an interesting thing, because really there's, how's the ad go? No rules, just right. Basically, compost is happening on the forest floor. Composting is happening on the forest floor all the time, and huge amounts are being made as we speak. Basically, the formation of topsoil from organic matter on the forest floor. So that is what you call almost a structureless pile. As we tend to want to decrease the amount of space taken up in the backyard, we might have a freestanding pile where you just basically throw everything into a pile where composting happens. Probably the next level up is a cylinder of rabbit wire or a cylinder of perforated plastic, which should have about a 4-foot diameter. And you throw all your ingredients in there. When you want to turn the pile, you simply lift the cylinder up, put it next, and then you shovel the material into the new location, and that will aerate the pile. Plastic trash cans can be used. Most are of the polypropylene type, which is a fairly benign type of plastic. You can have rectangular type piles, usually about 4-foot by 4-foot by 4-foot dimensions. And these can involve wood, or they might be made of recycled plastic. You can end up with a combination of bins. As they call it, the Cadillac composter is oftentimes 3 bins placed right next to each other with a shared wall. And in shoveling the ingredients or pitching the ingredients of one pile into another, you automatically aerate it. And by going back and forth that way, you're fulfilling your aeration requirement. And then finally, if the 3 bin composters, the Cadillac, I guess the roller type composter would be like the Lincoln or the Rolls Royce. These are usually cylindrical. They're either rolled on the ground, or they may be on some kind of structure where you turn a handle. Supposedly you can get compost in a couple of weeks with those, but you have to make sure the ingredients are very well balanced, your nitrogen and carbon. I've had one and it does work fast, but you got to make sure the ingredients are well balanced. And above all, just remember, composter is a place where microbes meet and propagate, and they're not fussy. They've been doing it for billions of years, and they've kind of got the act down now, so that as long as you provide them with roughly the appropriate ingredients, they'll find a way. So here I have a couple of different shaped composters. The one on the left is that rectangular type bin. The one on the right is the bin made of a plastic trash can. The one on the left is excellent. This is made of recycled plastic. They can be a little expensive. You buy them on sale if possible. I think I got this one for about $50, and it's lasted well over 20 years, and it's still going strong. The one on the right, you simply buy the trash can and you drill holes in certain areas to achieve certain results. You drill 1/4-inch holes. I put about 5 in the bottom of the trash can in case I got an accumulation of water and I want it to leach out. And you put 1/4-inch holes in equidistant lines around the base of the composter, roughly about 6 inches apart on the vertical. I think I have 8 lines around the base of this composter. Also, you can get a PVC pipe, 3-inch pipe, put 1/4-inch holes, 4 equidistant lines of these holes around it. To build the compost pile with this, you simply put the pipe into the base, and then you layer a 12-inch layer of carbon-containing material, 12-inch layer of nitrogen, 12-inch carbon, 12-inch nitrogen, all the way up to the top, and put the top on. And then this is something that I like to do. It tells me a lot about what's going on. I get meat thermometers with 6-inch stems at the grocery store. They're fairly inexpensive. You just stick a couple of them into the holes of the composter, of that plastic trash bin composter. There's 3 types of bacteria that operate in the pile. Psychrophiles from about 28 to 65 degrees. Mesophiles, your medium temperature operators, from about 40 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the thermophiles, which are your high temperature operators, from about 100 to 160. When you go past about 120, you're actually killing weed seeds. This pile is operating very quickly. It's a very fast mode. It's hot. You can see this location here is at about 130. This one here is a little over 150. I watch the temperature. Within about 3 days, it'll reach a maximum, and it's pretty close to maximum right here. And then it'll start to back off. At that point, I just take the top off, refluff the pile, get a little more air into it, put the top back on, and I watch the temperature increase again. It'll increase to a lower temperature and then come back down. So you've had 2 thermal cycles, and at that point, you've taken a lot of the water off. The grass is an ingredient that I really like to use in this pile, because this type of construction allows a lot of the water to vent through the pipe, through the white pipe, and as it's doing so, it pulls the air in through the sides of the composter. Had to put here a little nostalgia photo. This is from our demo garden. It's a 3-bin composter, and once again, the Cadillac. You also note that we have these breathing pipes in this composter as well. Helps to let air go down into the compost pile, helps to let moisture come off. Troubleshooting a compost pile. Generally, if you don't have the 4 key ingredients in proper match, the nitrogen, carbon, air, and water, you will start encountering problems. If they're out of whack, out of balance. If you have a sulfurous rotten egg smell odor, that basically means that the pile has gone anaerobic, that you may have too much moisture in the pile, too much nitrogen, that you've squeezed the pile down, air is being omitted from certain parts of the pile, and that region goes onto a sulfur cycle, which of course generates the bad odor. To alleviate that, you can simply turn the pile to get air to those areas, and you may dry the pile out by adding a little carbon, mixing a little carbon matter in as well. You may also get a nitrogen smell at certain points from the pile, and generally that is when the pile has a little too much nitrogen, and you get ammonia being given off. Ammonia is made up of nitrogen, and to rectify that, you simply can mix more carbon into the pile, more carbon matter. If the pile is not heating up fast enough, generally it means you don't have enough nitrogen matter in the pile. You may need to turn it to get more air into the pile, and you may simply need to add a little more water to get the pile as moist as a wrung out sponge. You're always trying to keep it as moist as a wrung out sponge. And notice as the pile has certain dimensions, about 4 foot across, you start getting a bit of self-insulation, and the heat created, if you have a pile that stands about 4 feet tall, the heat created in the bottom of it tends to move upward through the pile and tends to drive the composting faster in the higher elements as well. And then finally, my last bullet point is really just saying, hey, get back to basics, okay? It's the summary of having all 4 ingredients in good harmony. Fast composting will be achieved if you cut the particles up into small pieces. They're well aerated, they're the moisture of a wrung out sponge, and you've got the appropriate blend, roughly 25 to 1 blend of carbon to nitrogen. So what tools have I found to be of value in a compost pile? Handling the compost, generally I have these 3 tools that are all I really need. Number 1, I have this D-fork, which allows me to reach down into the pile and pull certain elements of the pile up, push them around, lift them, get more air into the pile. This device here, the compost turner, I find to be incredibly valuable. It's a shaft, and by the way, you can get these in like garden supply catalogs, etc. It's a shaft with retractable barbs at the bottom, retractable wings at the bottom. When you push that shaft down into the bottom of the pile, the wings retract up against the shaft. When you pull it out, the wings open up, and I kind of like to auger it out through the pile. And in doing that, I create an air shaft that goes down, and I also pull elements from the bottom of the pile up to the top. So that, by piercing of that 4 foot by 4 foot container from the top about 12 times, I've totally turned the pile by using this device, and it only takes about 5 minutes. Finally, this screen that I have in the back, simply made by stapling chicken wire to a frame, is useful when you're processing finished compost. You simply take that screen, you put it on top of a wheelbarrow, you shovel the ingredients, you shovel the compost pile ingredients onto the screen, you shake it, what goes through can go into your garden, and what remains goes back into the compost pile. At that particular point, you should have reduced the material in the compost pile to a crumbly, dark colored substance, humus, which is crumbly, will have some agglomerates to it, but basically at that point you've got finished compost, and you can go through this process of sieving. Finally, just a very brief discussion of what's going on in terms of the, I guess you'd call them the fauna of the compost pile. Bacteria is usually I consider it the heavy lifter anyways. It's, there's, I don't know, trillions of them maybe in a pile. They ingest carbon to create energy. They use nitrogen for growth and propagation. And as these materials are broken down by bacteria, the byproducts are food for higher members in the chain. I call bacteria, I call it my micro piranhas, because these guys really put piranhas to shame. They are able to go with such ferocity and ingest the ingredients with such ferocity that they actually raise the temperature of the pile from like 80 degrees all the way up to 160. And I've never seen piranhas or ever heard of them able to increase the water temperature to 160. So I give these guys the blue ribbon. Other types of bacteria, we have actinomycetes, fungi. They all feed on the organic matter and also use phosphorus and potassium as helpers also in their process of digestion. The microscopic decomposers, which I've just mentioned, bacteria, actinomycetes, protozoa, and fungi, they ingest the organic matter, the carbon and nitrogen in the pile, and they have different temperatures that operate. The bacteria, your prime line is able to operate at very diverse temperatures, all the way up to 160 degrees, all the way down just a little below freezing. Your actinomycetes and the protozoa tend to operate when the temperature comes back down a little more to normal ambient, and the fungi also. The hierarchy in a compost pile, if we call level 0, as we go to higher levels, you're getting higher up on the totem pole of your food chain. But your level 0 would be made of organic materials. They're just the organic food that you provide to the pile. It has different carbon nitrogen ratios. Level 1, they ingest this material from level 0, and they would be the bacteria, actinomycetes, as we mentioned before, flies, earthworms, sow bugs, etc. Level 2 then will ingest members of level 1, their mites, springtails, roundworms, flatworms, etc. And then finally, level 3 ingests the items, the elements in the levels below them, centipedes, spiders, rove beetles, ground beetles. So they're basically, it's a Serengeti in your composter. I've included this picture because it shows a compost pile that's partially decomposed. It's a very interesting. This is a compost pile. It's gone through the high temperature operation and has been curing at medium temperatures for longer periods of time, called by some what would be called curing the compost pile. The interesting part is you see some of these ingredients. You see this kind of grasses kind of go into a funk. You see this gossamer veil type, which I'm assuming is some kind of fungi, which is operating in the pile. You see mushrooms, basically. You're seeing the heads of them and the stems, and you're seeing just the general breakdown, because ultimately in the final humus, you do not recognize the shapes of any of the forms that were ultimately provided the pile. So they were busy losing shapes from some of these entities already. Using compost. Compost can be used in a number of different ways in the garden. You can side dress plants with them during the growing season, put them down the rows between plants or put them around tomato plants, etc. When I pull out like a spring crop and I put in a summer crop, and the spring crop comes out, I like to put 1 to 2 inches of compost in that area that the crop came from, and then just kind of work that into the soil with a cultivator. And finally, of course, after Thanksgiving, late in the year, you can put that 1 to 2 inches of compost on the garden Leave it on there. I don't dig it in. Some people do turn it in. I leave it on top. The freezing and thawing breaks the particles down into smaller entities, and it gets imbibed into the soil. So, the final summary. We've talked about composting and how it eases environmental pressure. We've talked about compost as a valuable soil builder, one of the best amendments to the soil you can have. It makes the soil act like a soil sponge. We've talked about getting rid of our household waste and yard waste and processing it into this treasure called garden gold. We've talked about composting not being hard. Any shape a composter will do. And we've talked about the ingredients, carbon, nitrogen, air, and water being in proper balance for trouble-free composting. Simple tools make a simple job even simpler. And the inhabitants of the compost pile, as long as you provide them with the appropriate environment in the pile, they'll work tirelessly for you 24/7. And then finally, your garden welcomes compost in a variety of uses. I want to just go to a final page here and talk about some great references that I have, which have been a tremendous help. The best, I think, is as a reference by Stu Campbell called Let It Rot. It is a very good blend of discussion, practical aspects of a compost pile, plus enough theory to let you make sense out of that. This easy composting, see if I can get around the collards here, is a book published by Ortho. This will tell you all you need to know about composting. It's a little less theoretical than the Let It Rot. And it also talks about the zero waste management aspects, which I find very helpful. And then the final one by the Rodale folks, Rodale Book of Composting, I found to be, of course, the treatise on it. It has large amounts of theoretical discussion, what goes on in the compost pile, as well as hard, pragmatic information. So there, that's it. Anybody, if they have questions, we can open things up, and we can even discuss this. I'm sure that you all have different tips and different comments to add based on maybe your different waste stream ingredients and different techniques that you may have tried over time. So we're open now for discussion.
That was great, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. Yes.
Sorry, I was on mute. I wanted to ask you a question. On your slide, you had that legume hulls are a good source of nitrogen. Is that just when they're green? What happens when you dry them out?
Yes, generally, if you dry things out, you get rid of the nitrogen matter. It's like grass and hay, say. Okay, and so you can, depending on where you interrupt that, it can have different amounts of nitrogen and carbon. Yes. Okay,
so if it's green, it's
generally
full of nitrogen, and when it dries out, you put it on the carbon side of the fence.
Yes. Oftentimes people say, not quite accurately, but they'll say green or nitrogen containing elements are green and wet, carbon containing elements are brown and dry. Well, that's oftentimes true, but of course you got coffee grounds, which are nitrogen containing generally, and they're brown and wet.
Brown and wet.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great presentation. I love the arrangement of your slides.
Thank you.
Are you going to be giving this to one of your garden groups?
Hadn't planned to, but it could, I suppose it could be.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
What'd you think, Avery? Did you learn anything?
Thank you, Avery.
Good.
So does everybody have a compost pile here? It's pretty hard to imagine a gardener who's been in the operation for more than a couple of years not having one. But yeah.
Mm.
It's Nina, and I would love to have a compost situation, but I have a lawn service that mows my lawn and rakes my leaves. And that leaves me with, no components for my composter.
It's still do something with your kitchen waste, of course, but that'll be a much slower and much
And smaller, right?
yielding, yeah,
Right.
process. Yeah.
And my daughter one time did an amazing, sort of not really planning to do a compost, but anyway, she grew the most amazing tomatoes. She didn't fill the pots with soil as much as she filled it with almost pure compost.
Sure.
They were the most amazing tomatoes that ever were.
It's not unusual to find potatoes growing out of the side of your
Really?
compost.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I almost feel bad about turning it at that point because, of course, I wreck them. But yeah, I've had potato stalks coming out of the composter and all kinds of stuff. Yes.
My daughter also grows potatoes, and she is very much into all of this, which I am not. I'm trying to go back to growing tomatoes this year, but she's had problems with her tomatoes, and she says she basically, by the time she buys them, that first of all, they are obviously very expensive by the time you get all the stuff in it, but she hasn't had a lot of luck in it. And I wondered, are potatoes heavily, do they require a lot of compost?
Well, tomatoes are kind of interesting because they can get blossom end rot.
Right. Oh, I know.
And blossom end rot is a bunch of things have to come together to make that not happen. But once you make it not happen, you'll be on the right track. Just the basis of blossom end rot is the fact that you have to get calcium from the soil to travel all the way through the plant, all the way out to the tomato. And it has to be done in a totally consistent fashion without breaking the chain. And so you can't let your earth dry out ever. So obviously having compost in the soil is very important to have all that moisture retained that it can give it back to the plant. You obviously have to have the proper amount of calcium in to start with, but oftentimes if you use grass clippings in your compost, you have plenty of calcium. And I also like to make sure I mulch with about 3 or 4 inches of mulch because that also helps water not leaving the soil. So if you can constantly if you have the right amount of calcium and you can constantly keep the soil moist, you shouldn't have blossom end rot problems. And that's that is probably the most problematic physiological problem of growing tomatoes. Before I was able to develop the right amount of compost, the right amount of organic matter in my gardens, I would have to throw away about the first third of my tomatoes before I started getting free blossom end rot.
Well, many years ago, I discovered blossom end rot and figured out what it was. And then the other thing was I was shocked by actually munching green tomato hornworms. They were just disgusting. Looked awfully healthy.
Getting your protein anyway.
Oh.
Right. You have to have small nectar-bearing flowers planted in your garden to bring in the beneficial insects that, especially the parasitic wasps that tend to do the hornworms in.
Oh. Did you hear that?
Rick,
No. Did somebody ask a question?
This is just Jack. Can you hear me, Rick?
Yes.
Oh, I just thought I'd mention that another problem with tomatoes are some of the foliar diseases like septoria and alternaria.
Mhm.
And the mulch also helps to keep those spores in the ground rather than splashing up on the plants. And so another reason for putting the mulch down.
Good point. Any others?
I have to go out and turn my compost pile after.
Yes.
I
Make sure
have
it's
one
as,
of those tools,
Hey.
and I need to go use it.
there you go. Make sure it's as moist as a wrung out sponge too.
Yeah, I don't know if it is. I'll have to go look.
Rick,
Yes.
I just came in late.
Hi,
'cause I had
Jane.
an appointment beforehand, but what were you recommending for mulching in a tomato area? Like pine straw or?
Straw is good, but I like, once again, the non-herbicided grass clippings. I have a medium-sized lawn and I use the grass. Sometimes I'll mow it back in, sometimes I'll put it in the composter, and sometimes I'll just use it in the as mulch in the garden. It's my favorite. I think did you say pine straw?
Yeah,
The pine needles, I think they're very good for acid loving things, used in moderation possibly, but I always am a little leery of pine needles unless I'm growing blueberries and stuff like that, which need high amounts of acid. I'm not saying it won't work, but oftentimes you can use, just regular straws is fine also. So whatever you have luck with,
when you say non-herbicide grass clippings, does that include like grub control or not? Grub control would be included in.
Theoretically, I'd be most worried about herbicides as far as the plant growing, like weed killers. But I never put anything on the lawn. It's been 20 years since I've ever put anything on my lawn. I put up with the ground ivy, a few other things. It's all green. It looks pretty good, and when it's going, and it's okay. I hear somebody chuckling. The ground ivy is my downfall, but
Rick, Sandy Taylor here. Where's the best location for compost? Is it in the sun, full sun, or shade and sun, or?
I've usually used it in a shadier area, mainly because I want to use the sunny areas for the garden. So I have it in a fairly shady area. You can still get tremendous temperature in the compost pile once you start incorporating the high nitrogen materials in there.
Okay, thanks. And another thing is, I always use I have a lot of pine needles, so I used them on the blueberries, but then I heard they don't have acid in them anymore.
Huh?
So I guess I have to research that more. But they're great
Yeah,
mulch.
I always figured it was the allotropic or effect of pine needles. You always see under pine trees, there's nothing under the forest floor below them. And I always thought it was the acid, but it may not be. It may be something else. One thing for sure, at various points throughout the growth of the nice blueberry plants we have in the demo garden, we have used acid enhancers made by not Garden Tone, Espoma, the Espoma products. They sell special products that have sulfur in them that help to lower the
Yeah.
acid.
Thanks. Okay.
Everybody all set? Well, have a wonderful afternoon. It looks, I don't know. I'm still seeing blue sky out there, and I guess we're supposed to have warmer weather, so it should allow certain things to grow a little bit better. But thank you all for coming.
Good job, Rick.
Thank you.
Rick.
And
Thanks,
happy
Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
gardening.
Very good.
And
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Good job.
thank you.
You.
Take care.
Yay, Rick.
Bye.
Thanks again. Thank you
Bye.
very much. Nice to see everybody.
Yes,
Take care.
absolutely. Take care.
Take care.